Hi, everyone who's on this amazing DigiMarcon Asia Pacific special. Today, I'm going to talk about the scientist within a marketer. And I know that generally we, as marketers, talk a lot about, hey, like how do we actually unlock the creative potential within a marketer? And today I'm going to be here to give you an alternative perspective about how do we actually unlock the scientist within a marketer and what are some of the things that we should be thinking about or looking at when it comes to making strong investment decisions when it comes to marketing best practices. So my name is Astha Kalbag, and I am currently a marketing science partner at Facebook. So that's my day job, but I'm also super passionate about uh, building my own unique voice and sharing my perspective about the latest campaigns within marketing. And I write a blog called mooketing.com. And aside from that, pretty involved in the industry as well, winning different awards, but also just love to meet people virtually or in person and understand what are some of the interesting and amazing new trends and directions in which the industry is moving in. So a little bit more about my journey. I've had different stints within different tech companies. So I see myself as someone who is building and learning for a digital first world. And within that, I've had a couple of stints from LinkedIn, moving to Skyscanner, Uber, and now at Facebook, and fundamentally focus within growth marketing, performance marketing, and now marketing science, which is what I'm going to talk about the science part of marketing as well. And along the way, I have been blogging as well. So super cool to just hear the previous session on how do you actually distribute good, solid content. And I think this is really a journey in which all of us have an opportunity of sharing our perspective, our voice. So please find me on mooketing.com and would love to hear from you guys as well. So on to the topic today. I'm going to talk about the scientist, right? And what does that actually mean? So fundamentally, when we talk about making different kinds of marketing investment decisions, we are looking at several different kinds of questions, right? So for example, what is the ROI of different channels? Which new markets should I enter? What demographics should I target, right? And how do I even split my budget between different strategies, right? How much should I spend on prospecting? How much should I spend on retargeting? How much should I spend on brand versus non-brand? And really, like, how best should I position my brand, right? What is the value proposition that I want to share with specific types of audiences? And how do I understand the true value that we are driving through this positioning? So here comes all of the magic, right? And when I talk about the magic, what does that really mean? So borrowing from our close friends in the science world, really, like, how do we not just apply this to marketing, but how do you actually build an experimentation cycle within a marketing framework or ecosystem, but also within every single marketer in an organization, right? And some of the things that we consider and think about when it comes to an experimentation cycle is fundamentally around a few core things, right? So one, what is the question, right? Like, what are we trying to unlock? For example, which new market should I enter, right? So what is the hypothesis? So the hypothesis is, hey, if I, expand my market to, I don't know, like Philippines, that's going to drive positive customer lifetime value, right? So that's the hypothesis. Then further down, like, what is the experiment and how do you want to define the experiment, right? And there's several different ways to go about it, right? It could be like targeting on a new channel, targeting on an existing channel, like figuring out how do I change my language for it to be localized, my creatives to be different, to resonate more with a better audience. So you build one experiment or a series of experiments to actually then unlock that question, right? For example, in our case, it's like, hey, I want to enter the Philippines. Specifically, like if we take one example of that experiment, right? So, for example, a very simple one. Do localized creatives outperform my generic business as usual creatives, right? So that is us setting the foundations of an experiment. We run the experiment with different kinds of testing, for example, split testing or A/B testing or running lift studies, etc. Right? So different kinds of measurement methodologies, which I will talk about in the slides beyond. But really, to set this up as a proper experiment is where I think we need to kind of evolve our mindset and thinking. Beyond an experiment, it's about how do we actually analyze that experiment, right? So, what are some of the tools that we're thinking about? What are some of the most important numbers that we want to look at, right? Like in our world today, we are sometimes overburdened with a choice and variety of numbers, right? You go into Google Analytics and there's just so much happening. I don't know what is, the North Star. Like, should I talk about just reach? Should I just talk about engagement? Should I look at, seconds of video views watched? Like there's just so much data. I don't know what do I actually look at as that specific North Star, right? So once we have that analysis done, and we map that to the hypothesis, which is the key metric, right? So in this case, we talked about Philippines and customer lifetime value as the North Star, right? So we figure out like, hey, based on this analysis, what is the conclusion? And in the example that I gave, the conclusion could be, hey, having localized creatives in the Philippines increases the customer lifetime value by 20% or 30%, right? And then there is a decision, right? So is this 20% increase of customer lifetime value something that's valuable to the business? Yes or no? And then is the additional investment that I would need to build localized creatives worth it or no? Yes or no? And that's when you make a decision, right? If if that decision in the current shape and form is invalid or we don't know, we want to iterate, then we further go into that iterative loop of a cycle to ask a follow-up question and then go through that entire experimentation cycle again. And why am I actually talking about the experimentation cycle, right? Like we all run a couple of tests here and there, but what we don't really do is understand how much this experimentation mindset can actually impact the way we make business decisions, right? So a lot of companies that I talk to and work with as well, right? Like the max that we test is like, hey, should I have a green background or blue background, or should I have text A versus text B? But how do we actually take the juices of experimentation and science to make strong marketing investment decisions, right? And that's kind of going to be the focus of my presentation today as well. So to go into this a little bit further, right? What is a good experiment, right? And the answer to that is a controlled marketing experiment. And when I say a controlled marketing experiment, what does that really mean, right? So what we want to figure out is, for example, like how do we understand the performance of a single specific marketing channel, right? So that's one way to think about what a controlled marketing experiment is, right? And why am I using the word control, right? Because as I will talk about a little bit more later as well, the controlled part of it is coming from the idea of having a control group and an exposed group, right? So if we just take a comparison to the experiments that are being run in the world right now, right, and with vaccinations, there's always a control group of patients or people who opted in who are not exposed to, any medication or vaccine. They're the people who get a placebo, right? And then there's an exposed group of audience which actually is exposed to a vaccine or a medication. Similarly, within marketing, there is an exposed group that are exposed to specific types of ads versus a control group that is not exposed to any ads at all, right? And the idea of this experimentation model applied to marketing actually helps us make the most scientifically sound decisions. And as I say, right, like people ask me, like, hey, so what is the metric that I should look at? And there is only one word for it, right? And the word is called incrementality. So incrementality is that North Star metric that we should be chasing when we build experimentation cycles, when we look at hypotheses, when we think about testing. And why is that, right? So incrementality measures causal impact. And I know there are a lot of words here, and I just want to take it slow and kind of break it down, right? So the idea of running controlled experimentations, controlled versus exposed, we are trying to measure incrementality, right? And I'll show you a diagram that represents this better. I think the word that we need to remember here is what is the incremental impact? What's the incremental impact on sales? What's the incremental impact on brand? What is the incremental impact on uh, lifetime value? And this is really important because in a lot of measurement or the way that we understand data and analytics within the marketing world today is actually based on correlation, right? So two variables are moving. For example, I'm spending more and I'm reaching more people, right? But I actually don't know if that reach is incremental or not, which is, would those people have watched my video anyway, right? So we see these trends, but we don't actually know if it was the investment that I made within a channel make that movement and increase reach, or they would have kind of converted, or I would have reached a broader audience anyway, right? So we want to understand how incrementality leads to causal impact and why that is the North Star metric. And within the marketing world, right? What does that mean? So what we are trying to understand is the differences in behavior when people are exposed versus not exposed to advertising, right? So in one slide, this seems really simple, right? Like, what does that really mean? We want to measure on one North Star metric, that is incrementality, and what is truly incrementality, and how is that applicable to marketing? It helps us understand the difference in behavior when people are exposed versus not exposed to advertising. And to give you a little bit more of a diagrammatic representation, right? And I think this slide would make it super clear, right? So the control group gets no ads, the exposed group sees ads, and the difference between these two is what is known as incremental lift. So going back to the first example that we had in the experimentation cycle, right? Should I expand to the Philippines, right? Should my business expand to the Philippines? And in this case, if I'm running brand activity and I start launching my product with brand campaigns, I want to understand that based on my media investments, do I see an incremental lift in brand outcomes? For example, is there an incremental lift in people remembering my ad, in campaign awareness? Is there an incremental lift in consideration? And if I start to see and understand what that lift looks like, I know that truly there is a true causal impact of my investments in that decision. And that is then the fundamentals of the North Star in terms of how to actually make sound scientific marketing investment decisions. And that's when we talk about what is actually good experimental design, right? So we're looking at incrementality. We understand that we need to measure causal impact. And we know the only way to do that is the way scientific experiments are run, which is with a control and exposed group, and understanding lift, which is incremental lift, not just, looking at specific numbers within a channel, or, for example, running a split test, right? We actually want to understand the true value, which is lift. And for us to do that, there are three key things that we want to make sure that we're doing, right? So randomization, for example, we want to make sure that um, all of the audience is randomized, right? So there shouldn't be any bias between what part of the audience is in the control group and what part of the audience is in the exposed group, right? So randomization is super important. The second one is comparability, right? So are the people in the control group and the exposed group compared like apples to apples, right? And in that case, does it actually make sense that the representation, the demographics, the way the behavior is, are they truly comparable, right? And what can we do to make sure that there's no bias within these two groups? And the third one is around statistical soundness, right? So we want to make sure that at the 90 or 95% confidence level, we know for sure that there is a true impact or true difference between the control and exposed group. So that's a lot of science, a lot of digging into the scientific side of a marketer. But I really believe that it's extremely core to actually unlocking the right investment decisions, right? And it's not just about having data or analytics, right? It's about running experiments and running them in a sound way to make sure that the data that we're reading is something that makes sense. And just to close it off, I think it's really important to not just have one or two marketing scientists or, like marketing investment data scientists, something like that, right? We want to get to a place in the world where we are continuously building this expertise and also building a culture of experimentation within the org, right? So building a testing and learning mindset with each individual who's in the marketing landscape, right? No matter if you're a creative or not, incentivizing learning plans, right? So it doesn't matter like what the outcome of these experiments are, but having a very deliberate plan into like, these are the hypotheses, these are the experiments, these are the conclusions, these are the KPIs is really important to actually build those plans and to incentivize those plans. And of course, right, to encourage failures. Like not all experiments are going to be successful, but how do we actually build a culture of failure and actually enhance that within every organization? And just to close it off, I think the future of marketing, in my opinion, is to become a scientific marketer, right? So we are in a world where, you know, it is we are overwhelmed with so much data, right? But how do we actually churn that and condense that for it to make sense and to make the right investment decisions on the back of it? I think that's gonna be the key that we want to unlock, right? And I think data driven marketers are helping businesses make sound investment decisions. And we want to make sure that they're based on a scientific and experimentalist approach. So with that, I'll come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. You can find me on LinkedIn, check out my blog at mookiting.com or write to me at astha@mookiting.com as well. I'll give that back to you, Kenneth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So got a few questions here from the audience. How do we start building out the measurement? This comes from Sandra, and I'm not sure where Sandra is or what part of the world she's in, but how do we look at measurement with all the channels? I'm not going to pick on Facebook, but I mean, Facebook is one channel. You've got so many different channels, so many different social channels, and they all have, pretty much walled gardens. And so when we start trying to really measure the incrementality of that lift, it's hard to do that with, say, 10 channels. Sometimes it's easy to measure Google to Facebook, or for example, you know what I mean. But if you
Yeah.
start pulling in all the different channels together to get a real measurement, it's hard to do without just modeling and guessing, which is never a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, sure. So let me first talk about on-channel incrementality, right? So like measuring strategies, for example, that I gave. A lot of these channels, including let's say Facebook or YouTube or Google, have within their experiments tab a way for you to measure something that is known as they're different names, but for example, on Facebook, it's called conversion lift or brand lift, right? So the word lift basically means that you have an opportunity to measure a control group and an exposed group and understand the true impact of your investments on that channel, right? So it's the same thing with YouTube as well. Like when you go on YouTube and you see like those surveys, right? Where like, have you seen an ad from XYZ company?
Mhm.
Those companies are the ones that are running brand lift and measuring based on this idea of incrementality, right? So these kind of solutions are already available on channel. On the area of cross channels, like I definitely feel like I resonate with that as well, right? Like there are these walled gardens, and it's difficult to understand um, cross channel measurements. Some of the ways that some of the more sophisticated advertisers potentially do that is sometimes to even like turn off a channel, right? So if you have all your channel spend stable and you're getting X revenue, then if I turn off a channel, then how much of that revenue is actually impacted? If it's not impacted at all, it's very likely that the
Mhm.
channel was not driving that much value, right? So theoretically, there are ways for us to kind of manufacture the idea of lift, which is like to build a control group. And I think those ways of understanding investment decisions are actually very good and also very scientific.
So another question that we have from Maya, who is from Tokyo, is, and I think this will fit into something that you and I have talked about before. Matter of fact, how do you handle a channel like TV, which also, I guess, with social and how you measure those two?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, this is something that, we've talked about before, and I talked about last year as well
Just
in my
so happens
presentation.
you did this presentation on TV last year.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So maybe it's a long conversation, but just to give a quick summary, right? Like the way that we measure TV in the past and how we measure TV today is evolving, right? And there are solutions that are available. One is the advent of like smart TVs and how that evolution is happening, helping us to make an easier comparison. But even if we're talking about traditional cable TV, right? Like when we look at um, I don't know, like GRPs and some of those kind of
Mhm.
metrics, like there are third party measurement or measurement agencies, for example, Nielsen, Millward Brown, all of them that have the ability to basically either run panels or to like put tags across different channels to then give you an overview of like, hey, what does your cross media investment look like? And what are the channels that are driving the most efficient reach or the efficient cost per reach, and understanding further then in terms of your investments and what the incremental value of those investments are.
I like this question that we got from Samuel, kind of sort of because it kind of goes with the description of your session. But he basically says, "What are bad experiments to try, or to try not to waste your time on?" But we know we're always told to test and look at the incrementality of stuff. But have you defined any tests that you've just seen were just sort of a waste of time?
So I think there's a difference between a bad experiment and a badly designed experiment. And I
Yeah.
fundamentally just feel like there are no bad experiments and there are no bad questions, right? There, you could have a very, very simple question, a hypothesis, which is like, hey, should I have an emoji in my ad copy or should I not, right? And it's debatable, like in terms of how much incremental revenue or incremental, I don't know, engagement that would bring. But I don't think it's a bad experiment, right? I think what is a bad experiment is a badly designed experiment. For example, if it's not statistically significant, if it's not run for long enough, if there's not enough conversions or data that you're reading the experiment result too prematurely. So I don't think they're like bad experiments, but I think that there are lots of badly designed experiments. And the worst thing about data is making a decision based off that data.
Yeah, and I think there was a follow-up comment to it was just having a limited amount of time, not to run the test, but to spend time on measuring it. They're probably running through the same problem that a lot of companies are running through, which is trying to attract talent that understands science, and science and math behind digital marketing. So let me read this question and kind of rephrase it. Well, I don't know if I want to. I think we're going to skip that question because it didn't really address the topic. So if anybody else has got a question, raise your hand now because otherwise we're going to go to a break in a second. But uh, I think if there's anything that you've noticed, I'd like to know what propelled you. I mean, obviously you work in Facebook at Facebook, which is has a lot of smart folks that are working in data science all over the globe. But if you're a marketer who's wanting to learn to lean into this even more, to apply it from a scientific standpoint, where does someone start?
Yeah, yeah, sure. In a way, I feel like that's kind of been my journey as well. I don't have a statistics background
Yeah.
or data science background, but I think the beauty of understanding experimentation is the point that we want to get to is that everyone can do it, right? And the world is becoming simpler and simpler for us in the sense like now you can go in a platform, you can select a tool, you can just put in your campaign details, and then the system is going to split the audience. It's going to make sure it's comparable. It's going to make sure it's randomized. It's going to also read the results and tell you at X% significance level, you can read this data, right? So the world is becoming much easier. It's really about how fast we are kind of catching up to it. And I don't think that, we need like very, very a heavy like talent that's based on a specific like statistics or data science background. It's really about how each one of us can actually unlock that scientist from within us and just understand some of the very bare minimum basics to then run successful experiments and make the right decisions based off the back of it.
So last question, this is more personal. It's the same thing I asked Damien earlier, and he's in Auckland and Christian's in DC. So I know how things are here in the States, but how are things at this point in Singapore from your perspective with COVID?
Yeah. Well, it's been a journey for us here. So in terms of vaccination, we're like over 80%. But we are actually seeing quite a bit of spike in cases. So we're trying to move as a country to a more endemic state, right? And I think we'll see as to when things really truly open up. But yeah, I just hope that everyone is, keeping safe and is doing okay everywhere across the
Agreed.
world for whoever's joined in.
Agreed. Well, Asta, thank you so very much. That's fantastic again. And I'm going to invite you, or I'm going to politely move you to the audience. But I really appreciate your time and joining us here at DigiMarcon. So looking forward to see you in person next year.